here's a barcode. It's the barcode for our WeChat discussion group. So you are more than welcome to just scan the code and join us. We will collect the questions from this group during this talk. If you have any questions, please make sure you post them in this WeChat group. Also, you can post your questions on the Bilibili platform, and we have volunteers there to collect questions. So make sure to scan this code. So today, it's our great honor to invite Dr. Josh Levine from the University of Arizona in USA. Josh is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at UA. Before starting his career at Arizona in 2016, he was an assistant professor at Clemson University from 2012 to 2016, where we started to know each other. And before that, he was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Utah, the Ski Institute from 2009 to 2012. He is a recipient of the 2018, I think it's Department of Energy Early Career Award. He received his PhD in computer science from Ohio State University in 2009 after completing a bachelor's degree in computer engineering and mathematics in 2003 and master degree in computer science in 2004 from the Case Western Reserve University. His research interests include visualization, geometric modeling, topological analysis, mesh generation, vector fields, performance analysis, and computer graphics. Also, Josh is my PhD committee, so I have known him for many years. He is a very productive and active researcher. He serves as the chair of this year's VIS and makes his contribution to the VIS community. So today he will talk about neural representation for volume visualization. So let's welcome Josh. Time is yours, Josh.
All right, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to La and the CSIG organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I'm super happy to be here and really excited to spend the time talking today a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing recently. I guess I should share my screen.
Exactly. So let me just stop share my. Oops, what happened here? Well, here. Okay. Stop. All right, you can start sharing a screen.
All right, let's try this. Okay. I'm assuming everyone on the other end can see the slides okay?
Yep.
Great. All right, well, let's get started. So thanks again for the introduction. Like Les said, my name is Josh Levine, and I work at University of Arizona. I'm an associate professor there. And today I want to spend some time talking a little bit about using machine learning tools, in particular what I'm going to call neural representations, for doing work in the VIS community. There's been a lot of research lately on using visualization to understand AI and understand machine learning. This is not, unfortunately, what today's talk is going to be about. It's really the other way around. It's how can we take advantage of machine learning and AI tools to help do better visualization, which is really where my home field is and the sorts of problems I like to study. So by way of introduction, I want to start a little bit with just answering a few questions for everyone in the audience. My understanding is it's a big, broad audience, so I want to tell you a little bit about myself, and hopefully people can be comfortable about where I'm coming from and what are the sorts of things that I like to do. And I'm going to start by trying to answer these 4 questions for you. So the first question is who's involved with the work that I'm talking about? And in particular today, there's a collection of collaborators that I want to give credit for the work. And I'm going to tell you about 2 different research projects that I've worked on over the last 3.5 years. The first project is a little bit older. It was published in 2018 in IEEE-VIS. We did the presentation. It was published in our main journal, IEEE-TVCG. And this was a collaboration with Matt Berger, who is a faculty member at Vanderbilt University, and Jishin Lee, who is currently a graduate student working with me. He's a PhD student in my group. He's in his 5th year. Hopefully he'll graduate at the end of this academic year. So we're really excited about that. The second work I'm going to present is also a collaboration with Matt, but it's a collaboration with a few different students, in particular, an undergraduate student working at Vanderbilt, Brian Liu, and a PhD student working in my group, Kairong Jiang. And this is a work that we presented just recently at EuroVis 2021. The relationship between both of these works is they're using neural representations for different aspects of volume data and volume visualization. So that's where all this comes together. Matt and Brian and Jishin and Kairong did a tremendous amount of work here, and they really deserve a huge amount of credit for all the things I'm going to talk about today. So that kind of covers the who. Let's spend a minute or two talking about the where. I work currently at University of Arizona. This is in Tucson, Arizona. It's only about an hour drive from the border between US and Mexico. So it's really far south. And it's kind of a super interesting place to work. It's a pretty large university. There's about 40,000 students who go to this university. And Tucson, Arizona is a city that I suspect many people haven't heard of, except for occasional television shows that are set in Tucson, things like that. It's fairly close to Phoenix, Arizona, which is a much bigger city. It's about an hour and a half by car from Phoenix. So just to give you a feel for what Tucson looks like, I grabbed a couple of photos from Google, and in particular, this is a photograph of what the campus of University of Arizona looks like. I've highlighted for you the computer science building. We're spoiled a little bit. We're in one of the taller buildings on campus, and the computer science department is on the 7th, 8th, and 9th floor, so right at the top. In fact, that red arrow is more or less pointing at where my office is in the building. You can see downtown Tucson in the background, and behind that, you can start to see a little bit of the landscape. There's lots of interesting mountains, and kind of it's a very interesting city to live in. About 750,000 people live in Tucson. Tucson's also interesting from a climate perspective. It's in a part of the region of the world that's called the Sonoran Desert. This is shared between the US and Mexico border. And it's the sort of place where when you think of desert, you think of cacti, like these sorts of saguaro cacti that you see in this picture. So it's really kind of a gorgeous place to live. It is very, very warm. In the summer, the average temperature is around 40 degrees Celsius. It can get up to 45 on a really hot day as well, too. And it's very, very dry. We get about 270 millimeters or about 10.5 inches of rain per year. So most of that actually is concentrated in about a 3 or 4 week window in August. And then pretty much the rest of the year, it's dry and clear blue skies all day long. So very, very gorgeous place to live. And like I mentioned, and like La mentioned, actually, I live in Tucson right now, and I work at University of Arizona, but actually I'm not really from this part of the country. La mentioned a bunch of different places that I've lived in between, but I tend to associate with being from the state of Ohio. This is where I did my undergraduate and graduate work at Case Western and Ohio State, respectively. And I really grew up in what people call the Midwest, and that's where a lot of my family and friends currently still live. So I'm quite far away from them, but it's also a great place for them to come visit if they want to get away from some of the colder parts of the year and come out to U of A. So that covers a little bit of the who, a little bit of the where. I'm going to spend a minute hopefully motivating why. Why should we bother doing the research that I'm going to talk about today, and what do we stand to gain if we do it well? And in particular, what I'm going to focus on today is the task of visualizing what is called scalar data, or scalar fields commonly is what we would refer to them as. And these are used as a model for all sorts of different complex scientific data. And I'm giving you a little bit of a mathematical expression on the slide. I will throw in some math today throughout my talk. The basic idea here is I have some domain or some space that I'm looking at. I'm calling that M. And at every position in that space, I have a value that I'm storing. And that value is some scalar value. Literally, I have a collection of just points throughout some space with some numbers associated with those points. And you can use this to model really a wide, diverse set of things. If I wanted to study temperature on the surface of the Earth, at every latitude and longitude, I could have a temperature value in Celsius. If I wanted to study an engine simulation where I wanted to understand how much fuel was burning in the various parts of the engine, I could use a scalar field to model how much fuel is in there. If I wanted to study cellular data and a particular concentration of water, again, I could use that as a scalar field. So it's over and over again, this comes into a very simple model of just at every position, I have some values that I'm looking at. Interpreting that data, though, particularly when the data is three-dimensional, has all sorts of interesting challenges that have really led to decades of work in visualization. So I don't want to pretend that today I'm either solving the problem, nor am I actually creating the problem. This is a long-standing problem in the field of visualization of how best to do this sort of data analysis. Particularly today, we're going to focus primarily on three-dimensional or volumetric data or volumetric scalar fields. So I'll frequently refer to that as I have some function in X, Y, and Z that actually will record for me the scalar value at any position X, Y, and Z. This is a bunch of text. It's a bunch of math that we're looking at. I think it's easier to motivate this with some simpler pictures. So in particular, I have on this slide just some pictures of what are the sorts of things you can do if you visualize scalar fields and what are the sorts of pictures you can get out of here. And I just want to spend a minute dwelling on these examples of all the cool things that we're able to see if we do visualization well for volumetric data. On the picture on the left, we're really able to see inside of what a human would look like. And this is from a medical scan where you can see things like the skeletal structure, you can see things like organs, a little bit of venous structure and so forth. The picture on the top right is actually looking at just focusing on a brain scan. And in particular, it's telling you which parts of the brain have been activated for a different sort of tests that were being done. The bottom left is an example that's coming from something like a combustion simulation where we're looking at a fuel injection and we're able to actually see the dynamics and the shape of how fuel distributes through an engine. So this gives us a lot of rich information. It's very, very visual and helps us kind of see the sorts of things that might be very, very difficult to see if we just ran a test on our own. For the medical images, it's very hard to know what's inside of a human without cutting them directly, and that's, of course, destructive. So the visualization techniques we have here really promise to offer a lot of different things that we can do to better understand data. So with that, I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation talking entirely about the what. So in particular, I'm going to spend time talking about, well, what are the sorts of things that we can do to visualize volume data? And in particular, I'm going to motivate some interesting ideas that we can do with neural models. So the first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on what we call a generative model for volume rendering. And in particular, if you're interested in finding and playing around with the code here, the code's all online on GitHub. You can download it from this repo that my co-author Matt Berger has hosted for us. So to start with, I want to tell you a little bit about how do we do visualization when we have volumetric scalar fields. And in particular, I'm going to give you a little bit of a cartoon model for this. So on this slide here, what you see is we have something like a volumetric data set. That's this kind of gray cube that I'm showing here. So I have this three-dimensional cube and I have scalar values at every single position. And what we typically do when we volume render is we say, well, let's pick a position for which we want to look at it at. And that's what this little kind of eye sort of glyph is showing you here on the left. And then set a set of parameters that are going to be called a transfer function to design how we want to view it. What that transfer function actually encodes for us is it encodes a mapping from what the scalar values are to sets of optical properties. And in particular, those optical properties are, we're going to assign color for every single scalar value and opacity, or how much we can see through, or how transparent the volume is. And from that, we put it into a process that actually generates an image like what you see here on the bottom left. So high level from the cartoon, what you should extract from this is a volume renderer necessarily needs some set of controls for how you might set up a viewpoint. And that's what we're doing here with this kind of eye glyph, where we want to look at the volume from. And then these things that I've called transfer functions, which are basically things that help us control how transparent we are going to have in the volume so that we can see in between and kind of peel away layers, and how we want to color things so that we can map those individual scalar values into colors that we might be able to interpret in different ways. This is more or less what a volume renderer looks like, but I think it really doesn't actually capture what you can do with a volume renderer. So I'm going to switch my screen for a second, and I'm going to demo for you a standalone volume renderer that you could actually download and use today if you wanted. So one second, let me switch. All right, what you should be looking at now, now that the screen has come up, is a tool called PairView. This is a free open source tool. It has lots of different tools for visualization, and in particular visualization of scalar data. But in particular, one of the things it has that just comes in standard is a volume rendering tool. And we've loaded up a simple volume. I can rotate it around and set kind of what perspective I want to look at it from. And hopefully everyone can see these sorts of animations as we go through. What you're seeing right now is just basically the boundary, the kind of the bounding volume that contains all the data that we're looking at. And if I want to study this data, well, one thing I could do is just turn it into a collection of images. I could add a slice into the image, and we could take a look at that slice. And that tells us a little bit of information about a particular set of values. In particular, I've sliced kind of just along this plane here. And you see, as I look at it from the side, it actually starts to look a little bit like a tooth. It turns out, unsurprisingly, you may have read the file name here. This is a tooth that we're looking at. And it's actually a medical scan, a CT scan of a tooth. Free data set we can find online to kind of play around with. What I've done in the slice, and what you've seen here, is I've color-coded the visualization. So in particular, I'm mapping the individual scalar values to individual colors. The very low values, the values at 0, are mapped to these kind of dark purple colors. The values at around 2000 are mapped to a white color. And the values that are really high are mapped to these kind of shades of orange. And in this slice here, there's no high colors. We're basically just seeing only the whites and purples going through. And of course, if I pick a different slice, I can move around and I can see different parts of the volume. I can get different aspects of it if I slice through, but it's kind of unsatisfying. The data is 3D and we're looking at it with just a collection of 2D images, not particularly interesting to look at. So let's try out and see what we can do with the volume renderer. Well, I'll turn the slice off for a second. We'll go back here and we'll switch this to a volume rendering mode. So that's all I'm doing here when I select volume. Now you can see a very different view of the data set. Again, I can rotate it around and look at different parts of it. We see this kind of purple cylinder. It turns out the way this scan was done was they took a tooth, they put it in a little metal cylinder, and then they scanned the whole thing, and the metal actually gives us some response in the data. What I haven't told you about yet is this picture on the right, which is the transfer function design that we get to have. Again, you see a mapping that tells me mapping from scalar values to different colors. The low values are mapped to purple, the high values are mapped to this orange color. And then you see this black curve here, which is actually controlling that level of opacity. It's the opacity transfer function. Right now, low values are mapped to 0 opacity, which means you can see through them. And high values are mapped to be fully opaque or opacity of 1. As I manipulate this curve, I can change the view that I'm getting. So for example, if I had a point here and start to move it around, you should see the volume render updates and you get now kind of fully opaque, that version of that cylinder there, which isn't really useful. We're not able to see anything on the inside. So let's instead do the opposite. Let's actually make this more transparent so we can start to see through it. And let's add a couple more points here. And now what I can start to do, if I carefully select where I choose to put points, is I can actually capture a description of that tooth going through. So I more or less set the outer cylinder to be transparent, and I'm only now setting things to be opaque that are the tooth itself. And I'm doing that rendering process along the way. Pretty interesting. I can do some interesting analysis here. It turns out the cap of the tooth has higher values. So if I actually peel this away a little bit more and focus here on something like just the cap of the tooth, I can get just that top region going through there. I can maybe make part of it transparent so I can see partially through, and I can get to see things like maybe the roots of the tooth. If I play around with colors, I can switch things around as well. So for example, I could switch my color space to something like this yellow and red color space, apply it here. Now you see I have a way to kind of change and manipulate it around. With a volume render, you get lots of flexibility. You basically have to design this transfer function, the color transfer function, and the opacity transfer function. You also get to pick where you look at the volume from. So that gives you a wide space to kind of navigate and explore data. One of the coolest features of the volume render is that you get to do that exploration. Unfortunately, one of the issues is doing that exploration is quite difficult, and that's what this paper aims to solve. So let me switch back to my slides and we'll bring those back up. All right, so like I was hinting at, there are some challenges here. So in particular, there's challenges of how do we let the user figure out which controls they want to manipulate? What's the best way for them to choose how to create an image from a volume render? Second is, how do we guide the user to understand, well, what could they even see? What is the space of possible views that a given volume can generate with a volume renderer? There's a pretty wide dimensional parameter space you have to look at. How do we get from volume data to parameters to select to final image that we want to look at? And is it possible to provide some kind of overview? Is it possible to actually give the user not just information about a single view, but actually lots of views all at the same time? And it turns out this has been studied for quite a while in the VIS community, but no one has really thought too much about, well, can we use neural models to kind of figure out better ways to do it? And that's kind of the contribution we made at the time. Some people have thought about it since, but in 2018, it was kind of a new thing to think about. The related work on this, though, can be broken down in kind of two big groups, I would say. The first group is a group that basically says, how do I tell the user what way to edit? And in particular, by edit, I mean what way to edit a transfer function. And they often do so by giving the user additional information, something like a histogram underneath, which actually tells you which sets of values are stored in which positions, things like sensitivity that help you understand a little bit about how the image might change, and so on. The other big family of techniques is a family of techniques that actually focuses on trying to present all possible images that you might look at. And these are through what are sometimes called volume overviews, or basically giving you a summary of a collection of possible images that you might look at. These are then encoded in lots of interesting ways, whether they're graphical or whether they're done with other sorts of flow techniques and so forth, to kind of present and kind of organize this data. And in fact, the work I'm going to present today is similar in some sense to the work on the right. It's basically saying, let's generate a collection of overviews and then try to summarize those in a new way. To do so, though, what we're going to do is we're going to actually apply a kind of interesting trick. The trick is basically by studying a little bit about how a volume rendered image is generated in the first place. So I'm going to give you another cartoon here so you can study it a little bit. And again, with the process of volume rendering, you start out, you have this volumetric data. You can think about that as a 3D grid where you have values at every one of the corners, and you have a camera or an eye where you're going to look at it from. You have an opacity transfer function and a color transfer function. You put that all together when you volume render, and what you end up getting is you get essentially a process that's called the volume rendering integral, where what it does is it actually takes all that information you've passed. It uses typically a raycasting or a texturing process, maps the data in, and then the net result of that is it produces the image that you're looking at. So most of the techniques that I mentioned on the previous slides, what they're doing is they're actually studying analysis at the level of trying to analyze what are the right parameters to use when you pass in to this volume rendering integral. I'm not going to get into all the math of how that integral works. It's a fairly complicated integral. A lot of computer graphics and computer viz experts have spent time trying to optimize and get that integral as fast as possible. So you get interactive tools like ParaView I just showed you. But as a result, they've actually kind of optimized away some of the analysis along the way. So if you do analysis at this stage, your main intellectual problem is the analysis is really removed from the final image that you produce. You're really only studying the input space, but you don't actually pay attention to the output space. What we do in this work is we actually study not the analysis on the kind of input side, but we study the analysis at the integration side itself, at the volume rendering integral itself. And by doing so, what we can actually do is we can study it instead of by looking at the analysis itself. What we do is we replace the volume rendering integral entirely. And in particular, what we replace it with is a deep generative model. So this is basically a neural model that now, instead of encoding the volume rendering integral, what it does is it actually encodes the process of going from some set of inputs to some set of outputs. The interesting research question here is, can doing this analysis at this stage actually give us information about the data itself? So by specifically analyzing how the volume rendering process works, does that actually tell us or help the user understand the volume better? And the answer I'd like to say is yes, it does. In fact, it gives you lots of interesting information. What we're really doing here is actually we're following some of the ideas that have come out of the computer vision community that are really focused on this idea of analysis by synthesis. In particular, what we're going to do is we're going to try to improve volume exploration by basically learning how a volume renderer works. And that learning process is going to be based on things like deep learning. We actually apply a couple different techniques to do so. These are similar in spirit to techniques that people have done for other sorts of synthesis tasks. So in particular, in computer vision, there's tasks like in-paintings. Pothik et al. Has an interesting paper of basically how do I fill in the gap of missing pixels in an image and kind of complete that along the way. Or another kind of synthesis task you might see in computer vision is how do I color a grayscale image? So again, how do I manufacture new data from partial data along the way? We're not using either of these techniques directly in our work, but these are interesting to compare as data points for other sorts of neural models you could use that basically help you complete new information along the way. So I'm going to dive into a little bit about how our network architecture is done. And from there, I'll actually show you some of the results, because some of these results actually, to me, are quite surprising that we can even do this in the first place. When we actually got this to work on our end, we were pretty surprised. I myself was skeptical that we would be able to get this to work in the first place. And some of the reasons we got it to work had to do with really careful choices in that network design. So let's spend a few minutes thinking a little bit about what sort of architecture might make sense for this. And in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to try to learn the process of volume rendering. That means what we're going to do is we're going to learn a mapping from volume rendering inputs, so in particular, camera positions and transfer functions, to volume rendering outputs, the final image that you get produced for a volume render at that particular viewpoint and at that particular transfer function. The scheme that we're going to do to get this to work is going to be based on now a well-known technology, but in 2018, it was actually something that was fairly new and fairly kind of interesting to study, that are called generative models. And in particular, by generative models, what I mean are generative adversarial networks, or sometimes called GANs, and these are popularized by Goodfellow et al. These techniques are interesting because they don't do a single neural model. They actually do two neural models or two neural networks that work together in concert to solve a particular task. In particular, in a GAN, you have what's called a generator network. And for us, the generator is going to be a network that takes as input a camera and an opacity and a color transfer function. So all the inputs to the volume rendering process. And it from there will generate the output volume rendered image. So basically our generator is more or less replacing what the volume renderer would do in the first place. A GAN though has two parts. The second part of the GAN is actually what is typically called a discriminator. And in our case, what the discriminator is going to do is it's going to act like a classification network. And in particular here, it's going to take as input a pair of volume rendered input parameters, the camera and the transfer function, and an image. And what it's going to do is it's going to tell us in just a binary way, is the image actually the image that should be produced at those set of parameters, or is it a fake? Is it an image that wouldn't have matched for those volume rendering parameters? So the cool part about the GAN is you actually take these two networks and you jointly optimize. So basically you take the outputs of the generator, you pass them into the discriminator, and you use the discriminator to basically make the generator better at its job, while the discriminator simultaneously becomes also better at its job. And in particular, you can think about this in kind of phases of how you might go about optimization. On the one phase, what you're going to do is you're going to update the discriminator by basically getting it to determine real images from fake images. So here we pass in ground truth images, ground truth opacity values, ground truth camera parameters, and the discriminator gets trained to learn that these are in fact the real sort of images. The discriminator then also starts to look at images that are from the output of the generator. And in particular, the generator, the very first images it starts to produce in this optimization are going to be images that don't look very good. They're going to have some kinds of noise or artifacts in them. And when we pass those into the discriminator is going to look at them and it will tell us those images are actually fake. Those are not the true images. But then we update. We then feed back from the discriminator information that we learned, and we use that to improve the generator. And during that update, we basically say, well, we know that this image you gave fooled the discriminator. So now what we're going to do is try to figure out better ways to make our fake images no longer be passed as false, but actually be passed as true. So we then take the output of the generator, pass it into the discriminator, and we continue to make the discriminator, in some sense, better at deciding are these real or fake images, but simultaneously the generator is getting better and better at making images that fool the discriminator. During this optimization process, you continue to update essentially until the discriminator can't figure out the difference between fake images and real images. So along the way, basically, the discriminator gets really, really good, and the generator also gets really, really good. The optimization for this is actually quite difficult. It's fairly nuanced because what ends up happening is an optimization that's kind of like a knife edge. You basically have to go up one side and go up the other at the same time. And when they finally converge together, you resolve, but it's a pretty unstable point that they converge together. There are lots of details about this, in particular about training in the paper. If you're interested in learning more about GANs, I think the paper also gives a pretty good tutorial for GANs. But if you're just interested in kind of getting into the details there, I definitely recommend check out the paper. So that's our generative model. Well, what can we do with it? So let's look at some of the results. And in particular, like I said, the results here are really quite interesting to me because we basically have now we'll take the generator and we'll use it to replace the volume render in the first place. The discriminator actually we then throw away and we don't even use anymore. We just use the generator. And so the question is, can it actually do volume rendering? The answer is, yes, it can. And it can do it, I would say, pretty well. So what you're looking at on this slide here are 4 different data sets and 4 different camera positions, transfer functions, and so forth. In the left column on each, the ground truth column, these are actually what a true volume render would produce. And in the right column, the synthesized column, these are actually what our generator produces. And if you look at them at a glance, they actually look pretty good. If you start to look a little bit more closely, you're probably going to say, well, wait, Josh, these are not necessarily perfect images. For example, I can see in the synthesized image on the one on the top right, yeah, there's some differences in terms of the structure there. And for example, in the bottom right, you can see, if you look very carefully, there's some color shifts in terms of what the image is produced. There's lots of different ways to do these sorts of optimizations. Actually, in hindsight now, in the last couple of years, people have figured out even better ways to do this sort of optimization. But this, for our purposes, was pretty good. And in particular, our goal was not to just replace the volume renderer. Remember, our goal here is actually to make something that acts sufficiently like a volume renderer so that we can do more analysis on the data. Another thing to take a look at if you did want to do a test here for how close is it, is actually put these two things side by side. So in this little video clip here, what you're going to see is on the left-hand side is a volume renderer. We're actually using a volume renderer from VTK, or the Visualization Toolkit. And then on the right-hand side is our generative model, where we essentially take the input parameters, push them into our model, and then spit out the image. One thing to note is that generative model is very, very quick. So as you see here, we can actually do this in real time. So now in this video, as it's playing, the generative model and the VTK renderer are working in concert. They both actually have roughly the same frame rate in terms of how they appear. And you can see as you start to interact with the model, both by either rotating the camera or by changing the opacity transfer function here, a new point's going to be added to the function, and manipulating the color as well too. It is a pretty close match. Not, again, exactly perfect, pixel perfect at least, but it's pretty good at getting most of the main features going through. For me, this was an achievement. Literally, when Matt walked into my office and he said, hey, we should try this out, Josh, I said, Matt, it's not going to work. And he proved me wrong, which I was very excited about because it meant that we could do really interesting things with this sort of data. As the animation continues here, you're seeing playing around with the color transfer function as well. And you can start to see some of the visual effects, especially in animation. When they move, you'll get a little bit of kind of some shifting in the colors as things move around. So the real question is, well, what can we do with it? Or what did we really want to do with it? And the answer here was do better analysis on the data itself. So in particular, what we did was we took the generator. Again, the generator takes as input a camera, takes an opacity transfer function, and it spits out a corresponding image associated with the data. Well, one thing we can do with that is we can actually take that model and we can do things like differentiate it. And in particular, by differentiate, what I mean here quite simply is we can look at any output pixel in the image and we can actually pull it back against the generator. And we can ask, well, how much does that output pixel change if I start to change some part of the input space? So in particular, if I wiggle part of the input space around and maybe move that transfer function a little bit, how much would that resulting image, or how much rather would the resulting pixel change directly? And that mathematically is in fact a derivative. We're looking at the derivative of the pixel color relative to the transfer function itself. That derivative gives us a notion of sensitivity. How sensitive or how much will that pixel change for a small change on the transfer function side? We can basically use that derivative to measure sensitivity because the magnitude of that derivative basically tells us how much the output will change relative to the input. In particular, we can do it for pixels, but if we can do it for pixels, we can also do it for regions. So we can look at chunks of the output image and we can say, let's look at the norm and say, how much does that image region change if I adjust the transfer function? Ostensibly, this seems just like a mathematical tool, but in fact, it ends up being a tool that's pretty useful because we can now give the user a tool that actually looks at the transfer function and says, how sensitive will the transfer function or will the output image be if I wiggle some part of the transfer function around? And that's what you see in this curve here. So I'm going to play a little bit of a video to kind of help understand this. But essentially, the view you have on the right is we have, again, the color and the opacity transfer function. But we've drawn a pink curve underneath this curve that hopefully you can see here if you follow my mouse around, that's showing you which parts of the transfer function are going to be the most sensitive regions, or rather, if I change the transfer function in these positions, it will affect the largest change in the image itself. So let's watch the video for a second. You can see as it's going through, basically we're looking at what we call global sensitivity, which is kind of total sensitivity, the entire image through there. But we can then also localize it along the way. And you can see as you move the mouse around here, we're showing you which blocks of the output image are going to change if we added some point of the transfer function where the mouse currently is. And in particular, what that means is we have both a global view and we have a local view. Basically, our local view is local to what part of the image. And we're using this purple to yellow color map to show you where the largest changes might be in the output image, which is useful for analysis because now it helps you a little bit to understand if I change the transfer function, what changes would help me see certain things in the image. In particular, on the next slide, if we add a point right where the mouse is, you'll see adding a point there is going to change the region that was highlighted in purple. And this helps the user make design choices on where they see certain parts of the data, or how do I explore certain regions of the data in terms of how it affects the image I'm looking at. This helps guide, ultimately, the sets of edits a user might do when they're doing this sort of transfer function design. You can see here now they're going to add another point along the way. What's also interesting is this sensitivity is dependent on camera. So as you rotate the camera around, you get a different sensitivity curve. Again, we can compute that along the way, and we continue to add features if we want to see different aspects of the data going through. So it's kind of a neat little tool to kind of help understand a little bit about not just where the data is, which is what a normal histogram would do here, but actually how we can affect the final output by changing things about the input. So I'm going to unpack the network a little bit more to tell you a little bit about how we actually do some of these things. I won't go into too many details, but this is going to be a little bit of an architecture diagram to kind of understand it. And in particular, remember, we have the inputs of the camera and the opacity and the color transfer function. And what we do is we do a collection of convolutions and a fully connected layer for the camera. The camera we encode as a small matrix, basically a 4x4 matrix. And these things all get merged together in the generator. And then through a 2D convolution on the other end, they end up finally producing an image for you. What we're really doing in these convolutions on the first stage is basically we're using them to do some kind of dimensionality reduction. In particular, we represent the opacity transfer function and the color transfer function using arrays of size 256. We go through some dimensionality reduction process when we're doing our convolutions, and we end up with something like a latent space. Here, this latent space is really an encoding of what are the possible dimensions of possible opacity transfer functions. So that all gets fed into our network. If we study the latent space itself directly here, we can actually add onto the network to do even more sort of analysis. And in particular, what we can do is we can use this to actually decode a space of possible transfer functions. So given any 8-dimensional latent space that's representing the opacity transfer function, I can always pull it back and it will give me a particular representation of a possible transfer function. What that means is that I can now sample this 8-dimensional latent space, and doing so, I actually am able to sample all possible transfer functions. If I do that, I can actually give the user a view that helps them understand the space of possible transfer functions, and in particular, the space of possible transfer functions that generate similar images on the output end. So this is where the latent space gets kind of encoding. It's both encoding the space of transfer functions, but also the space of relationships between transfer functions and images. Doing so gives us lots of interesting analytic tools. So what we can do is we can take samples in that latent space, we can project them. Here you see a TS&E projected plot of this. And in that latent space, we can use it as a navigation tool. So I can let the user, instead of drawing a transfer function, they can move around to a point in this latent space, and we'll give them the decoded transfer function. And of course, we can push the same thing through the network and get the decoded image associated with it too, which helps the user, instead of having to manually figure out what the transfer function is, they can just move through the scatter plot on the left and pick transfer functions as they go. And there are relationships in here, although I don't want to make too strong a claim about the latent space and what you can do as you move around in it. But for example, here's an instance of a user navigating through this latent space. The blue dot that you can see is looking at the current transfer function. And here as they move around, so here they kind of rotated a little bit higher up, they get a different transfer function they're looking at, which gives you some relationship. It shows you a different aspect of the skull. Here you can move around again. Now you're getting something more like the skin surface as well too. And here you can move around again and you're getting that sort of output structure along the way. So instead of thinking about transfer functions as which ones are nearby by which curve is most similar, we're actually thinking about them as which are nearby by moving around in this feature space. If you can do it for one, a nice thing about the neural network is you can actually do these things in batch. So you can do them for many at the same time. What that means is instead of just letting the user look at one transfer function at a time, we can have the user look at many of them. And in fact, what we're doing in this plot is we're going to take the same projection of the latent space. We're going to take this 4x4 grid that I've drawn on top of it. And for all the points that are in each grid, we'll take some average of their latent feature and then push them through our network to get some notion of an average image. This gives you something like a gallery of possible views that you could see with the particular opacity transfer function spaces that you're covering here. And you can do this pretty interactively. So on this next slide, I actually have a video that's showing you how a user might navigate through this. So let's watch the video play and I'll kind of narrate at the same time. Here you're seeing the user adjust the camera position along the way, but the opacity transfer functions are independent, so they don't move around, just the images that you see along the way move around. Here the user is navigating through that space by moving around a single point. And as you see, as they move into an individual square, the image you generate in the top right is corresponding to the blue point is similar to the images that are in the associated 4x4 grid underneath. And you can continue to navigate along the way too and adjust. So this gives the user basically an overview of all the possible images that they could see and do exploration within there. They can also rebuild the grid and focus on a certain area of the data if they wanted. So that's what just happened there. We focused on a different grid piece along the way. So it's a pretty interesting tool and it gives you lots of analysis power. And again, the main takeaway here is it's not studying the volume directly, it's studying the process of generating images from the volume, which is kind of an interesting way to think about how the world works. Here, what you're seeing now is we're updating the color transfer function. Everything updates simultaneously. What this is really showing you is the independence of each of these different attributes. The color transfer function and the opacity transfer function independently feed into our network in terms of taking a look. So that's kind of it for the first part of my talk. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and also talk about a different neural model that's in particular a model for doing representations of scalar fields themselves. So unlike the previous work where we were representing the volume rendering process, in this work, I'm just going to focus on taking a scalar field, which those end up being actually kind of large, unwieldy data sets, and figuring out nice, compact ways to represent them. Like the previous work, my collaborator, Matt Berger, has the code on his website if you want to take a look at it. It's actually a really kind of simple model that you could probably download this and run it on your own on any kind of standard PC along the way. So the main challenge I want to focus on is in volume rendering, we still have this challenge of very, very large data. So these phenomena that we're looking at that are volumetric are typically very densely sampled, and they're often very complex, so they're run with great expense. We do a lot of work to generate them, and this work is often on a high-performance computer. We store the data somewhere there, and we do dense sampling in space and sometimes in time if we're doing a four-dimensional data set as well. This particular data set you're looking at is a volume rendering of a combustion simulation. It's a jet kind of surface here, and you can see there's kind of two different layers going through it. It's sampled in the following way, so I'll use this sort of notation. It has 512 samples in the first dimension, in the x dimension, 336 samples in the y dimension, 768 samples in the z dimension. So if you think for a minute, well, how much data is being stored here? And every sample is a float 32, so it's 4 bytes of data. You basically have 4 times 512 times 336 times 768. And this is a huge amount of data. It's actually not a big data set, though. This is what we would call kind of a small data set in kind of today's parlance. I could take this data set and put it on my laptop that I'm presenting on for you, and we would be able to visualize it no problem. Most volume data sets, though, the ones that are really looking at interesting scientific phenomenon, are much, much bigger than this. And they grow in basically a cubic sort of way. So if I double the X dimension and double the Y dimension and double the Z dimension, I now have 8 times as much data that I have to work at. And true volumes are probably on the order of 4,000 by 4,000 by 4,000, just to give you a feel for kind of how big the numbers are. So we have tools that generate this data, but our downstream analysis tasks like visualization, they actually don't scale because they're not able to keep up with all the techniques we need. Often we're taking the data and then we put it on a GPU, and as a result, we actually run out of memory pretty quick. So our first problem here is actually the analysis that we want to do on this data. It's often performed on, instead of the HPC that generates it, some commodity desktop that you might be working with, and you typically cannot always fit the data in memory. So the volumes are just too big. The second problem is that even if you were able to work with it on a commodity desktop, the data is usually generated somewhere different. And as a result, often what you need to do is you need to move it around. So if I have very, very large data sets that are gigabytes or terabytes or petabytes in size, I now have to move them from some HPC resource over to my desktop machine to do the analysis, or I need some kind of remote analysis tool. By the way, ParaView is a tool such like that where they say, well, do the viz on the HPC itself and then only pass back images. So that's a solution for this. Another solution, though, that's very appealing is to use data compression. So you start out with this very, very large data set. And what I do is I figure out a way to compress it, make it smaller, and then I can move it around. And if I compress it in an interesting way, maybe I can do my viz directly on that compressed representation as well, too. And there's lots of different techniques on compression. It's a fairly well-studied field. I'm not going to do a full review of everything that's in the field of compression. But generally speaking, in the viz community, most of the compression that people use is of the form of what's called lossy compression. Here, lossy means that you actually trade some of the original information in the data set for trading it to get a smaller representation in the first place. And there's 2 flavors of this sort of compression. The first is what is basically doing a loss with respect to how you chose to transform the data. This could be as simple as just taking every other sample in the data. You're transforming it by kind of ignoring every other bit of information, or by quantizing. Instead of using 8-bit number, or sorry, 32-bit numbers, you could use 8-bit numbers instead. The other way that people do it is they do fitting. They basically say, well, I'm going to build a mathematical model that approximates the data itself. In fact, what I'm going to tell you today kind of fits in the data fitting world, but most of the data fitting is using things like curve fitting or nerves or some other kind of spline-based representation. This mostly solves the I/O bound. You can take the data, you can make it smaller, you move it around. You do lose some resolution because it's lossy compression, but it's so at the expense of the data fidelity, you're able to kind of overcome these things. But they still come with concerns of, well, how much did I lose? So how much of that data fidelity did I lose? And as a result, lossy compression techniques, the trade-off is making the data as small as possible, but losing as little information as possible. So what I'm going to tell you today is a technique that gives you actually a little bit of both. It actually is smaller than other data sets and higher fidelity than other compression techniques in the same way. The trick is based on a neural network model. And in particular, the type of neural network model, it's a fairly modern model that's come out. I hope if people started studying this in graphics and viz, you've hopefully heard of something called implicits or implicit representations. And in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to apply an implicit neural representation, or an INR. What this is basically a neural network that's meant to solve an implicit formulation of some problem along the way. The particular one we're going to use in this paper is a neural representation that's called a siren style network, or an SIREN style network. So you have that implicit representation, but what you do with a siren representation is your neural model employs periodic activation functions, literally sinusoidal functions, rather than the typical things you hear when people talk about neural networks. They talk about ReLUs or hyperbolic tangent activations. There's a whole different collection of those along the way. The siren sort of model ends up working really, really well. And this is a fairly new paper. It's a paper that came out in early 2020. There's been lots of other work that's kind of extending on it along as well. And the authors are Sitzman et al. Along the way. So it's a really interesting paper that came out in NeurIPS, one of the top conferences for machine learning. To give you a feel for what siren cell networks done is I've grabbed an image from that actual paper, and this image is actually a video, so we'll watch the video for a second. This is a comparison of basically taking the image on the left, the ground truth image, and fitting that image with a collection of different neural models that are using different activation functions. You see things like ReLU and TAN and kind of the second and third column along the way. But in fact, what's happening on the right-hand side, the right-hand column, is the siren style network. And hopefully you can see that, first of all, it seems to fit the image much better. So the ground truth compared to the siren fit happens much, much faster along the way. And you end up actually having a much higher PSNR, or peak signal to noise ratio. Higher here is good. The larger the number is, the more of the signal you've preserved relative to the noise. What's a little bit less apparent and requires you to look at the image a little bit deeper is what the second and third row are looking at. They're looking at the gradient of the image, or the derivative of the image, and then the Laplacian, the derivative along the way. And the reason the siren style network seems to perform quite well is it also does well at the first derivative and the second derivative level. It does a fairly good job of capturing both those derivatives at the same time. Turns out other activation functions don't actually do a great job of capturing them. They do okay for the first derivative, although it takes them much more iterations to do the fitting to actually get to something that's closer. So this animation as it runs, the longer it takes, it means the model has to do more work. And they typically fail entirely on the second derivative. So that third row of images, hopefully you're looking at and you're saying, well, only the one on the bottom right looks the same. And that's actually kind of magical here from the point of view of thinking about, again, what we're trying to model. We're modeling continuous functions or scalar fields, and they have derivatives. They have first derivatives and second derivatives and so forth. Most other neural models and neural networks are looking at photographs. Photographs aren't really scalar fields. You can think about them like a scalar field, but they don't really model continuous things. There's layers and things in front of and foreground and background along the way. These neural models actually are really useful in that sense because they in fact build around the idea of not trying to capture things that are continuous. That's what a ReLU does well. Whereas the siren style networks, the main trick here is it uses an activation function, the sinusoidal activation, in a way that's actually really appropriate for looking at scalar field data. And that's kind of the magic here. I'm not going to go into all the mathematics of it. The paper is really fascinating to read, so I definitely recommend the paper that was cited on the last slide if you want to know more about this. But in particular, scalar data is really well modeled by implicit representations. What they show in that paper is that's true for images, it's true for volumetric data, it's true for sound. They actually show some notion of implicit representations modeling sound. It's true for things that are coming from physical equations and physical systems, like the sort of data that we've looked at as well. And in particular, scientific simulations can be captured super well by this. The main trick is they're using sinusoids. And if you remember a little bit from your calculus class, you can take a sinusoid, you can take its derivative, you get a cosine, you can take its derivative, you get another sine, and you can actually infinitely differentiate it. That's what the C infinity means. They have a full family of derivatives all the way down as much as you want to go. And that's really the trick here, is that this network, because it ends up being fully differentiable, allows you to model functions that are actually fully differentiable. I'm hiding a lot of the tricks here. I do apologize. I don't have, of course, forever to go into all the details here, but the main tricks go into things like, what's the right way to design the network? We added residual connections in there as well too. How's the right way to optimize it? There's some careful initialization along the way as well. But otherwise, the network is actually really, really simple. And it's simple enough I can describe it kind of just in one slide on the next slide. What we do here is we basically build a coordinate-based neural network. This network takes its input in X, Y, and Z position, so literally 3 numbers, and we ask it to predict one number, the scalar value at that position, f of X, Y, Z. All the network is in between is it's basically a collection of fully connected layers. That's what each of these green rectangles are along the way that require a sinusoidal activation at the end. Mathematically, it's basically a linear function, some weights times the actual parameters going in, plus an offset, and then a sinusoidal activation. We then basically connect up a collection of those layers, and we minimize the following function. Our predicted value, f theta, for any position pi, we try to minimize the sum squared differences between that and what the actual ground truth data is. So this capital X here is representing those grid of samples that we started out with. And if we do that well, we've essentially encoded the scalar field as a neural network. The trick here that's kind of interesting about this is that encoding is now actually capturing for us essentially the positions, the scalar values at every single position along the way. What is that doing for us? Well, it's basically allowing us to now have neural model that anytime I want to know the scalar value to position, all I do is plug in X, Y, and Z. So conceptually what this does is it basically just represents for us in an implicit neural representation the function f of X, Y, Z directly. So we don't have a grid of samples now that we have to interpolate or anything like that on. We actually just have something that returns for us a scalar field at any position we want. The cool thing about this is it gives us the scalar field at the original positions we started out with, but it also gives us the scalar field at any arbitrary position we want. So we can actually interpolate between data samples along the way. That interpolation, why it works, is very much built on the idea of adding up a collection of functions, very much kind of like wavelets along the way. But essentially, our neural model gives us something like an oracle for looking at the data directly, which is pretty neat. We also have random access directly. We also can differentiate the network and get gradients directly along the way too. What you're seeing in these bottom two images is I'm actually demonstrating for you that we can use this neural model both as a way to kind of represent the data, but actually as a way that's a direct oracle. So if you wanted to build a volume renderer where you actually have to sample the data over and over again, you could just call our model over and over again to do the sample. So it's actually kind of a cute replacement for the data set itself and anywhere you potentially want to use the data. We get full random access evaluation. So the trick here, well, I said I wanted to do compression, is the network, if the network itself is smaller than the original data set, and when I say by smaller here, what I mean is if it takes less bytes to store the network than the original data set as well, we can claim that we've done compression. In particular here by smaller, what I really mean is the number of weights in the network, all those parameters, the capital W's that I showed you, if those are basically, if I add up all of those and I have fewer of those than I had original grid samples, I basically compressed the data in some way. There's lots of other tricks you can use to make this even smaller. You can quantize the data. You can make activation sparser so that most of the weights are close to zero. There's a bunch of different tricks that you can do along the way to really compress and kind of eke out as much performance. But the basic idea is just the neural network ends up being smaller than the volume itself. Compression has happened, but it's lossy compression. It's not a perfect representation because it's doing interpolation and things like that. So at this point, I've probably teased you enough. You're probably wondering, well, how good does it work? Turns out it works extremely good. It works very, very good at representing data in much, much less space than the original data. Here's a gallery of 5 different volumes. I've done standard volume rendering on them, but here you shouldn't really look at the volume rendering. You should just look at the numbers in terms of what's happened and then how much the data has changed along the way. So in particular, the 5 different volumes, they're not so big. We're talking about a couple hundred megabytes along the way. We can compress them with very high PSNR. So the first number here that's dB is decibels, which is peak signal noise. 55 decibels is a pretty good number you can see along the way in terms of its representation. And that compression is about a 200-to-1 compression ratio. In fact, everything that's in the second row here has at least 54 PSNR, and most of them are compressed into about a megabyte or a megabyte and a half. So we've done a pretty significant compression along the way. If we go even further, we can take these and cut these in half even further and get them even smaller. We do start to see some reduction in terms of representation, but in particular, even on the image in the bottom right, well, we've gone from 512 megabytes to less than a single megabyte, so it's over a 675-to-1 compression ratio. We still have 46 decibels, which is pretty good, although at this point, you probably want to zoom in a little bit and look a little bit closer. So here's that zoomed in volume comparing the top right to the bottom right image. And you can see it's not perfect. It is doing a pretty good job of compressing along the way, but in the top right of the image, you can see there's some visual artifacts along the way. These depend a lot on how the volume itself is being actually characterized. Not all these volumes are continuous, but generally speaking, what we do is we experience these sorts of kind of structured noise that you see in the volume along the way. But for a trade-off of just approximating the data set, you've shrunk the data set by over a factor of 500, and you've actually done a pretty good compression along the way. That's a visual comparison. I think it's helpful to do a quantitative comparison as well too. So we took our technique, which is called neural comp or NeurComp, and we compared it to T-Thresh. T-Thresh is a fairly recent paper that's using a tensor compression based technique for compressing volumetric data. And T-Thresh is state of the art by pretty much anyone's standard along the way. There are lots of other compression techniques that are out there that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years. The T-Thresh paper in 2020 basically said, we are better than all of those other techniques. So here's the comparison to NeuralComp. And it turns out for the most part, NeuralComp is actually better than T-Thresh in pretty much all the different data sets that we experimented on. The way you read these charts is on the x-axis, you have compression ratio, so how much you've compressed the data. On the y-axis, you have quality of compression measured as PSNR. So higher PSNR is better, higher compression ratio is better. And in each of these cases, the orange or the pink curve that you see for T-Thresh is actually falling below the NeuralComp. It's not falling below by a significant amount, but I mean, a couple of different PSNR points, but we're able to actually get pretty good compression ratios. If you compare kind of horizontally, we're actually able to compress a factor of 2 or 3 more than T-Thresh at roughly the same quality in terms of PSNR. This gives you kind of a quantitative overview. It's pretty shocking that we were able to do really this well with the data along the way. You might wonder, well, where does it look visually different along the way? Here's a couple comparisons of the NeurComp versus the T-Thresh compression along the way. And I would argue that even if we're just looking at kind of measuring roughly at the same compression ratio or roughly at the same PSNR ratios, NeurComp is still doing a slightly better job than T-Thrush. T-Thrush along the way visually is actually adding in something that looks like much more higher frequency fluctuations along the data. You can kind of see this a little bit in the bottom left image or in the bottom right image, comparing how it does in NeurComp versus T-Thrush. So again, main takeaway here is more compression at the same PSNR or better PSNR at the same compression ratio. Here's a comparison on even more extreme conditions. So now we're actually just trying to make the compression actually be noticeably lossy along the way. We're doing 500 or 1,000 to 1 sort of compression ratios. And again, we're comparing NeurComp to T-Thrush. We compare them at equal levels of PSNR, but you can see NeurComp is getting about a factor of 2 more compression at the same rate. Again, if you compare these images along the way, you start to see some of the artifacts in T-Thrush kind of pop up in a somewhat different way than they do in ground truth. You can do some cool things with this network. I realize I'm getting close to the hour, so I'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. But one of the cool things that you can do is you can actually preserve not just the function itself, but you can preserve the function gradient. So you can ask the NeuralComp model to do even more preservation along the way, because you can differentiate it along the way. And in particular, if we change our loss function to include both not only a square sum differences between the function and the samples, but also add in a factor that's basically the difference between the gradient magnitude and the gradient of the samples, we can achieve roughly the same gradient or roughly the same compression ratios. Here we use just a small amount of gradient compression. Here we're using about 5%. And you can see actually we get now a smoother preservation of the surfaces. So we lose some of those oscillations and actually do a better job of maintaining the data. So generally speaking, by explicitly adding this in, it actually gets something that would give you a kind of maybe a better approximation at the course level, or a better approximation of just simply how the function is deviating. Here's some other comparisons, again, with comparisons against NeuralComp and T-Thrush, where we're using PSNR and we're also using the gradient PSNR. And you can really see here, this is one of the places that NeuralComp actually really shines. It does a great job of preserving the data when there is something about the gradient that kind of structurally satisfies the data. T-Thrush starts to show some artifacts here. To be clear, though, I'm not saying T-Thrush is a bad compressor. T-Thrush is an awesome compressor. I'm just saying NeuralComp is a little bit better than awesome. It is not perfect, though. There are a couple places where I think there are pretty obvious limitations. The first is it's a neural network model. Like any other neural network model, it takes time to train, but it doesn't take that much time to train. So here on the left, I'm showing you training for various different compression ratios and at various different training times. And these are times in seconds. So typically speaking, NeuralComp takes an hour or 2 to do a compression. And if you think about this in the context of HPC, you spend a huge amount of computational effort. This might be hours or days of running data, and it's sitting on an HPC server. If you have to add another hour in to do a compression so you can move it around, I think that to me seems reasonable. One thing that's interesting about this chart is as you increase compression ratio, you end up taking less time to train, which is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive. You're kind of doing more work. You're saying compress the data more. But as you can increase the compression ratio, what's happening is you're using a smaller neural model. So as a result, it doesn't take as long to train because there's basically less features that you're optimizing over. So you do get a little bit of an advantage there. I wouldn't say it's a great advantage. This is on a log scale, so maybe you cut the time in half or something like that. But it is kind of interesting to note that you can compress more for less effort along the way. It isn't perfect at modeling all kinds of data, though. In particular, if the data itself started out as fairly noisy, which is not uncommon for things like medical images, where there's noise that comes from the acquisition process itself, really that's not what this NeuralComp model is meant to do. It's modeling functions that are infinitely continuous, and noisy functions are models that, well, maybe the data is continuous, but they have really, really high frequency fluctuations in them. So as a result, a sinusoid isn't really the right activation to capture it. And you can kind of see that in this image here. We have this ground truth picture of this foot data, and it is quite noisy even at the ground truth level. And we can get, like a 25 or 50 to 1 compression ratio, but we're already kind of sacrificing quite a bit. In particular, the reason why is NeurComp is kind of smoothing over those features as it does the compression along the way. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I have just a few kind of thoughts that I think are interesting to think about from the audience, and then I'll open up for questions. I hope there's interesting questions coming in along the way. In particular, I think it's pretty cool that machine learning is offering lots of different tools to generate what I'm going to call surrogates. So the kind of family of work that we're kind of wrapping all this under is something that's doing a surrogate or a representative model of particular things like volume rendering or volumes themselves that basically act as proxies. We can use these to replace the raw data or the volume rendering process and actually use them to help us understand and do sorts of visualization on top of them. And this is kind of an interesting trick. Basically, the surrogate is giving us some alternative representation that's based on doing machine learning and doing analysis along the way. There are tons and tons of questions here remaining open. Basically, what I showed you, I think, are kind of really two good prototypes. They're looking at kind of the easy case of just a single 3D volume that I want to compress or that I want to volume render. There's lots of compression or lots of questions that come out when you're thinking about things like, how do I do this if I have an ensemble of volumes? I've run a simulation with 10 different parameters and I want to compare all of them. Or how do I do this when I have time varying data? In fact, we think time varying data could be pretty straightforward to work with these sorts of things because we can model instead of 3D, we can model a 4D space and model kind of the relationships between individual time steps. We can also do this for hopefully more complex data than just scalar fields. I'm focusing today on scalar fields because they're kind of fun and easy to look at. There's lots of applications, but there's lots of other data in the VIS community that we study that's vector valued or tensor valued. And here you can think, well, maybe I can model this now again with a similar neural model. So thanks a lot for paying attention. I want to do one final thank you slide for all the people who contributed this work, Jishin and Brian and Kairong and Matt. All my co-authors have been really tremendous to work with, so it's been really exciting. Both these papers are free to read if you go to arXiv, but they were published in recent VIS conferences in TVCG and in EuroVIS. And the source code for everything is online as well on my collaborator Matt Berger's websites at these two GitHub repos. And then finally, the work was supported by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy. I've been really lucky to have generous supporters that help fund the work and fund the graduate students who I've worked with as well. And finally, I just want to thank everyone for paying attention. Hopefully you found this talk interesting. And again, it's been my pleasure to be able to present this talk to everyone who's been listening. So thanks again, and I'll leave up this one slide just for the title of the talk. I can go back and jog into different slides if folks need along the way. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Cool. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for the fantastic talk. And I do have a lot of questions here we collected from different platforms.
Great.
So I think I'm going to start with the first one. An audience just asked this question in Chinese, so I'm going to translate it. And then for the rest of the questions, I'll just post them into the, excuse me, the Zoom, I'm sorry, Zoom chat box. So the first question will be a little bit related to my research area, like uncertainty visualization. So the question would be like, so you use like deep learning models to generate a lot of like render images, right? And there are artifacts, but in some scenarios, like for example, medical imaging, they always need like images with very high quality, So artifacts sometimes are not allowed. So do you have any kind of techniques or method to just deliver this kind of uncertainty or artifacts or areas not as good as they expected to the end users, and just remind them and just warn them these areas are not certain?
So this is a great question. I'm really happy you asked this question because it actually relates to some of the work we're working on right now. So I have lots of things to say and I have lots of thoughts on it.
Okay.
I think it goes back to this general idea of a couple things. So I'm going to flip back in my slides a little bit. If you remember on this slide, I talked about this idea of a surrogate. And basically, I'm going to replace the input volume data with some other representation that I'm going to use instead. I'm using it as a proxy or a substitute, right? So a huge problem with that is, well, what if the substitute isn't good? And this is kind of how I interpret what you're saying. Like, what if I know the substitute isn't a perfect representation? Medical imaging is a great example of this. Maybe you want that to be pixel precise because you want to know where the tumor is, in that medical image. And if you need perfect precision, I actually don't recommend you use these things. Like, just flat out, I think this is not appropriate for the work that we have for a very simple reason, which is that if you need the ground truth data, then I think you're stuck. You really do have to work with the ground truth data. And this isn't designed to be a solution. I also think conceptually, a neural model is a model that's based on studying a statistical distribution. So as a result, you are stuck with something statistical. You will always have some bound of accuracy. You'll never be able to make a neural model perfect. So it's not just the models are limited today, but they're always going to be limited in some way. That said, that doesn't mean surrogates are bad. Surrogates can be used in lots of places because they're good enough. And I think the TF-GAN work that I talked about in the beginning shows they're good enough for volume rendering. The compression technique is based on a line of work that shows, yeah, we use compressed data all the time. It is good enough. But the real question is, can you do more than that? And the answer is yes. I believe the answer is yes, at least. I won't be super strong on my answer yet. Because one of the things you can do with a neural model is you can ask that exact question of how good is this surrogate? And in particular, what we're doing right now is we're actually thinking about problems like this. So for example, if I have a surrogate that is replacing my original volume data set, and I do something like a volume rendering task on it, well, that's going to produce an image. It's not going to be a perfect image. But maybe the next thing we can do is we can train a neural network to understand how different this image is from the ground truth image. And if we can train it to understand how different it is, now that neural model encodes uncertainty for us. We can then feed that back into a visualization technique to help understand and now encode uncertainty directly. I'm giving you kind of high level because some of this work is still in progress, but hopefully you get the idea of, well, maybe the next thing to study is just where exactly is this surrogate failing to represent what the ground truth has within it. And if we can encode that, we can then present it to the user. So it's a really, really interesting idea. In fact, some of the NSF work that's funding in particular, my student Kairong is focusing directly on this problem right now.
Great. So I did post some kind of the questions in the Zoom chat box. So I'm going to start from the first one. Like the neural network only synthesizes pixel-wise images that looks like the real ones. How can it support interactions and analyze these tasks, see the slicing operations? I think that's a good question.
I think it's a really good question. This was a question that we were asked when we submitted the volume render work. So, I'll flip back here just to get people, to jog people's memories of what a volume render might look like. And I would argue that what you're going to see in this video here is the simplest possible volume render. It's basically, it gives you a pixel-wise image and it allows you to adjust the camera position. It allows you to adjust the transfer function. So in a true volume render, like in pair view that I just showed you, there's lots of other things you could do. You could do slices like the question asker proposed. You could look at different sorts of effects that are based on not just pixels themselves, but based on things like rays bouncing relative to normals, where you get different sort of shading operations and things like that. The short answer is a work like TF-GAN, it's not going to always be able to support all of those operations. What it will be able to support are operations that allow you to be encoded them in some kind of parameter space. So if I encoded something like a slice plane, I suppose I could build a model where that was something that would go in, but I think that would actually kind of fail to work well in our GAN-based model because slice planes can give you lots of weird, interesting configurations. If I want to encode something like ambient occlusion to get more of a 3D effect, that's something we think you can encode because that's just based on what the output images look like. And you could maybe encode turning it on and off and things like that. So the short answer to this question is, I think you can do some of these things, but I don't think you can do a full interactive analysis along the way. That said, remember the point of the generative model was not to replace the volume renderer. I think if you want a volume renderer, you should use a volume renderer. I don't actually think you should use a generative model to do so. If you want to analyze what the volume renderer is doing, I think the generative model gives you a lot of analysis tools. And you could couple that with a ground truth volume renderer. You could, for example, use the generative model like a preview, and then go back to the volume renderer and add additional information there. I appreciate that's probably not a perfect answer to that question in the sense of it's maybe not so satisfying, but it's at least a partial answer.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So the next question is, the current physical aware deep techniques usually enforce physical rules by adding regulation term in loss function. For example, the gradient preservation you discussed in the lecture, is there a better way to incorporate the rules in the structure of networks instead of just training process?
So I don't have a good answer for this in the sense of work that I've done, but the short answer, in my opinion, is the answer is yes, you can definitely do this. So why did we not do it? I think is an interesting version of the answer to the question. We're basically starting out with, in particular, gradient preservation. We're saying, well, somebody gave us a data set. That's it. I know nothing else about the physics associated with the data set. So for example, I don't know, is the data set something like incompressible flow? In which case, then the incompressible flow has certain rules about what can actually happen in the scalar field along the way. If you can give the rules as a way that can be encoded like an optimization function, I think you can actually do this sort of thing. So you can, there's lots to be gained from it if you know you're working with certain classes of data along the way. I don't personally work in this area, but I know somewhat firsthand a lot of people in the computer graphics and computational physics community that are doing things like this. There's an author whose name is Nils Thury. He works at TU Munich, and he's done lots of work on simulation, so physically based animation sort of simulation, where they have physics rules that are generating the data, but how to replace that with a neural model. Nils, though, is doing it from the computer science, computer graphics side, which is very, very interesting to look at. And him and his team are working on this sort of stuff. But there's plenty of people in the computational physics community who are interested in actually incorporating these sorts of rules into their simulations, whether they're things like fluids, like what I kind of mentioned with Nils' work, or things like, I don't know, a climate simulation, where you have extra physics along the way. Can the neural model be trained to encode that sort of thing? I think the short answer is yes. I don't know the full extent of what they could and couldn't do. And the reason why we didn't do it here is, well, we kind of assumed we're just given the data. If you give me more information, I would hope we can do a better job of preserving it. In fact, I think the Viz community at its peril sometimes ignores additional information that's given with the data and just assumes, oh, it's a block of floats and that's all I get to do with it. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I think so. So the next question is, for large-scale volume rendering, what criteria or principles should be used to balance the relationship between efficiency and accuracy when designing algorithms or models?
Yeah, this is, I'm not sure if I interpret the question right, because I think there's a couple different ways that it could be interpreted. So the interpretation I'm going to take here is, what's the best way to figure out basically the trade-off between how good is the model and how efficient does the model need to be? And here, good, I think, is something that a standard Viz answer to this is, well, I don't think just the Viz experts should figure out what good is. I actually think the right way to do this, if you really want to balance that relationship, you need to work very closely with somebody who's actually trying to do data analysis directly. Because I think there's going to be a collection of different criteria that define a good balance between efficiency and accuracy. So the high level principle I would take here, as wearing kind of my Viz researcher hat, is I would say, well, who's using the data? If it's a doctor who's doing diagnosis, right, they probably have very different constraints than if it's a computational physicist who's trying to study how the Earth's climate is evolving over the next 50 years. So the principle I would take, and it's a little bit of a cop-out, I'm cheating a little bit, I guess, is basically to say, well, I don't know that it's for the Viz expert to make the full decision there. The other answer to this, which I think is less satisfying, but it's a little bit easier to work with, is follow good mathematical principles. So in particular, trying to balance these relationships might depend on things that you can study directly or approximate directly with the data. But I don't know that that's as satisfying. I think here, if you want to do good Viz, you really do need to be interacting directly with the domains of interest for the data.
Yeah. Cool. So next question. Is it possible to develop a mathematical model for the first problem with some function analysis techniques? Another question is, how does a GAN method compare to a neural regression model that directly learns the mapping with an explicit loss function instead of a discriminator?
Okay, so this is a very technical question. I'm going to try to answer it, but I want to put a following caveat here, which is I'm a Viz person who does some machine learning. I am not an expert in machine learning. I've been learning as I go, and it's been very interesting for me to learn. That said, I do have some answers here to this, which is there a good mathematical model for this? Well, there was a recent paper that came out, coincidentally, by the same authors of the periodic activation function work. So David Lindell and his advisor, Gordon Weitzman. There's a paper that's called AutoInt, AUTOINT, which is actually building a mathematical model for how ray tracing works. And there's been a couple of papers that have come out in the last few years that are basically studying this. In the Viz community, Sebastian Weiss and his advisor, Rudiger Westermann, have also spent some time studying this as well too. And so these are actually asking the question of, take that volume rendering integral and figure out the right way to encode the integral in a neural network. So it is possible to do. At the time of the work in the paper, we basically said, well, let's not worry so much about the calculus. Let's just try to see if we can actually have a neural network do this. And this is actually what led us to doing a GAN. We thought a GAN would work well. What I've hidden for you in the presentation is, well, what exactly was the loss function of that GAN? How exactly did the generator work? And we ended up experimenting quite a bit. We used, in the end, things that were based on perceptual similarity for images. And in particular, we studied like Wasserstein sort of distances and trying to understand that. I think it would be possible to do this potentially with an explicit loss function and some kind of neural regression rather than using a GAN. And in some ways, I'd actually prefer that because I thought the GAN was very, very tricky to optimize. We spent a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, really experimenting with different sort of neural architectures. Our initial pass on this, though, showed that just a straight, neural model or straight neural regression model did not work as well as the GAN, and for reasons that you might expect. In the sense of the GAN is kind of, it's giving you the right sort of thing to optimize over. It's basically you're trying to, create images that look as real as possible. So in some sense, it's kind of appropriate. I think in hindsight, though, and seeing other people who've tried to use GANs and things like that, I think there are simpler models that might work fairly well. Maybe not exactly as well, and you might trade one thing for another, but I think it is possible to do. I'm not going to guarantee that, though, because I know in my own experiments, we found it very, very difficult to do.
Okay, cool. So next question, this question is from like one of my students, and he thought this might be a silly question, but I think it's simple, but it's pretty good. So regarding the input used for training the GAN, once the model is trained, is it support to work for rendering of any kind of 3D volume data?
No,
since the discriminator was removed once it is trained.
It's not even that the discriminator was removed. What we're really asking is, does the model generalize? And the answer here is, unfortunately, no, it doesn't. Generalizing over the space of all possible volumes is a very, very tricky problem. So we basically said, let's start simple. Let's work at one model at a time. So in particular, when you're looking at pictures like the picture that I'll show here, I'll just jump ahead. This generator that we build in the end, this generator is basically replacing both the volume and the volume rendering process. So it's a generator that only knows how to generate images for a single volume, and that's it. It does not generalize to other volumes. We have done a few side experiments on like how much can these things generalize, but you have to remember the space of possible volumes is humongous. I mean, if you wanted to generalize over volumes that are combustion-like models like this one here, or medical imaging models, or climate simulation models, or astrophysics models, they all generate very, very different spaces of volumes. So it might be very tricky to do that. But it's actually a really interesting question to ask. So I'm happy your student asked it, because there is a middle ground there, which is it possible to generate generators that generalize over a small space of things, and in particular, maybe a small space of time steps or a small space of ensembles. It turns out the best paper in VIS the following year after we submitted this actually explored this idea. It's a paper that's called In SituNet, and they actually said, can we generalize across different parameter spaces in addition to generalizing across input parameters to the volume images? So in particular, they studied ensemble parameters and time varying, and they showed you could do it in certain cases. So the answer is, yeah, in limited cases, you can probably do this, but typically speaking, for one generator per one volume. And the size of this generator, by the way, it's not particularly compressive. We showed in our paper a little bit of a hint that it might be smaller than the volume, but there's lots of situations where you'd want the generator to be about as big as the volume. So.
Okay, I see. Yeah. All right, so next question. What is the difference between deep techniques for volume data and traditional 2D image data? What are the specific challenges for volume data? Do we need novel network architecture or new training strategy? This is similar to the previous one, but I think it's still good.
I think it shares similarities with the original question. So if you made it to the end of my talk and you felt like you followed all of the technical things I explained in the talk, you probably realized I tricked you a little bit, in the sense of the first part of the talk. I said, we're going to focus on volumes, but I actually focused on images. I really said, we're going to train a network that, given an input, produces an output image. That was intentional. When this paper came out, we're talking about 2018, 2017 was really when we were doing the work on this. A neural model was not sufficiently capable of working with a large scale volume data set. The reason why is taking a huge volume data set and passing it into some neural network, it would require just too many parameters to work with for the model. This has changed. This has changed in the last 5 years. Our GPUs have gotten more sophisticated. They have bigger memory usage in there as well. We also have better techniques for handling things that are directly volumes themselves. And now you can actually train on volumes themselves, rather than here we're training essentially on images. So the main challenge, to answer the kind of question directly, is volume data. Well, it's an extra dimension, which makes it much bigger. And so it's very hard to train. Even if you do and look at kind of the image training things, a lot of the original neural network models for images were working with very small resolution images. They weren't working with images, of the resolution of even 500 by 300. They were working with like 50 by 50 or 100 by 100. And over time, they've been able to scale up and work with bigger models. Same is true for volumes, except for volumes, well, I need something that's 700 times bigger if I'm going to go in 3D for this data set, right? So do we need novel architectures? I don't think you're really going to get around any of these architectures in terms of structure, but the places where you might see these sorts of things are training strategies that are based on things like super resolution. And here there's been actually a decent amount of work, both in the Viz community and in the machine learning and the computer vision community on what's the right way to scale up data. And I think that's a really promising thing to think about here. By comparison, if you look at the neural model we used, in this paper, the neural model, again, doesn't encode the volume directly. It doesn't take volumes as input. This neural model takes as input positions. So it takes as input X, Y, and Z positions and spits out, a value. So it's kind of, again, getting around that. And in fact, part of the work that we're doing here is not training on volumes directly, but training on things that give you volume-like properties. And so in that sense, yeah. Otherwise, though, the only other main thing I'd point out is for visualization, not necessarily for volumes versus images, but for visualization sort of data, often the data is some kind of continuous object rather than something like a photograph. And that implies architecture choices like sinusoidal activations really start to make sense. So there are some ways that you would change the world around if you're modeling things as a function rather than modeling it as just a collection of pixels. Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, it's a very deep question that I don't know when we'll have a good answer to. If graphics cards continue to grow at the rate that they're growing, maybe 5 years from now, I'll come back and I would give you a completely different answer to this question. Maybe volumes are no problem, and the next big thing is something even more complicated. Yeah.
Okay. So the last question from our audience. Deep techniques are often difficult to explain and usually does not guarantee any math properties. For example, PSNR for compression. How to make the techniques trustworthy in this case?
Yeah, this is also a very complicated question that has, I think, not necessarily a great answer. So the work that I presented here, just to be clear, there is no guarantee for either of the networks that I have that they will work. They work well in practice. We showed them in practice, but they don't necessarily come with a mathematical guarantee. There are certainly people in the theoretical machine learning community who are trying to show various guarantees. There's good intuition about why they work okay, because what they're really doing is they're fitting, right? They're doing something like a data fitting or a distribution fitting, and that you can come out with some kind of bounds on. And that's what the theoretical people are saying, which is if you fit data in this way, what are the bounds? In the same way that if I do a piecewise linear fit of some 1D function, I can give you a bound on the amount of error that would be there. Numerical methods give us techniques to study that. I'm a Viz person, though. I'm not a machine learning person. And as a result, I don't necessarily care about guarantees, but I do very much care about being honest with the data. So this actually goes back to the question that La was talking about, the first question he asked, which was basically, well, how do we actually show data that we have some uncertainty about? I actually think machine learning tools are very promising for this. I think we can use machine learning tools not only to do visualization and representation, but we can actually use them to diagnose error as well too. And so in that sense, we don't get a certification. We don't make them trustworthy by proving, but we do make them trustworthy by being honest about what they do. I actually think this is a failing of the machine learning community for many years. They don't do quite as much now. But I think when we think about what a neural model does, we think about it as it spits out a yes or no answer. Well, it does spit out, if you're doing classification, let's say you want to classify a bunch of images of cats or dogs, it does spit out a yes or no answer, but there's an error term there. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. And I think we conflate the two. I think sometimes we say, well, this neural model, it gives us an answer, and we just assume that the answer is always correct. Same would be true in this Viz community as well too. So I think the right thing for people to do is to develop tools that actually analyze those neural networks and use them to be trustworthy and present that trustworthy information. I would argue that some of the things we were doing, for example, with showing sensitivity of transfer functions, we're actually trying to look at that by studying properties about the model and how those properties manifest. We're using them for a different reason than trustworthiness, but a lot of the work that I've talked about with surrogates are really about how do you make surrogates actually trustworthy to work with. I think people should be somehow, have a healthy skepticism about neural models in the same way that I think people should have a skepticism about statistics, right? Statistics doesn't tell you yes or no, it tells you a distribution of answers. But I think that's an issue in communication. I think people should not treat this as this is the right answer. In the same way that if I give you 10 numbers and I told you the average of those numbers was 5, Well, I've only told you one bit of information. There's a lot of things buried in the notion of what an average is. And so making sure that we're clear about the communication, this is something Viz people should be responsible for. We shouldn't say, here's the picture. We should say, here's the picture and here's some notion of where the picture is correct and here's where the picture might be incorrect. So it is difficult to do and it's important to do. I think that's kind of the main takeaway for this question. This is a question that if we do wrong, I think we've made a big mistake. And if we do well, I think we've actually changed the way in which we will go about kind of doing data analysis in a very broad sense.
I see. Yeah, actually, I really like your idea. Like we can use deep learning or artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques to not just trying to solve problem, but also trying to diagnose errors or uncertainty. I really like this idea, and I believe that. So personally, I have a question. Just go back to the very first question, like the visualization has uncertainty, right? Like your techniques generate uncertain area. So is that possible to just use like artificial intelligence techniques to extract those areas? You already answered that part. But I'm thinking about like if you can train another network or just extend this a little bit, just focus on this kind of area with artifacts, just trying to train another network to just fine-tune this area to generate more high quality, like higher quality rendering results, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you can, in some sense, you could say, can I improve this, right? But I think in the end, you're still stuck with a neural model it models some kind of statistical distribution, right? So there's always going to be an error term. The real trick is being, accurate with it. Exactly. I think though there's tons of room for improvement here when we say accuracy. So let me bring back a different image. And these are images I used and we compared and we spent time talking about today. So in particular, like this image here, where I'm comparing neural comp to t-thrush. I'm giving you something quantitative. I'm telling you the PSNR differences, and I'm giving you something visual. I'm showing you the difference between the images. Well, this is kind of a simple way to do comparison, in my opinion, right? It's simple for a couple of reasons. I'm boiling it down to one number, PSNR, which is an average. Basically, I'm telling you something like the mean amount of error, right? That's PSNR if you look at the computation, basically as based on mean squared error. And that's volume, so it's positional. And then I'm showing you the result of a process, the visualization process, volume rendering, and what the image looks like. Well, what prevented me from picking the very best image for neural comp and the very worst image for t-thrush? I guarantee for you we didn't, because I think it's very hard to find the best image and very hard to find the worst image. But it's also very hard to capture exactly what the neural model is doing in this sense. Can we use other neural models to understand that? I think has a hidden benefit here for the Viz community, which is that evaluation, qualitative evaluation, lacks sometimes this rich description of the space of all possible things. It's very common in a Viz or computer graphics paper to just say, hey, look, here's a bunch of pictures. We use our eyes to decide whether or not they're good or bad. But I think the eyes don't tell the full story. I think they tell a good story. I think they're useful. I'm not saying, we should never evaluate this way, but I think we're missing an opportunity to study a little bit more. Where it becomes interesting for volume data is the picture that we look at, the 2D image that we look at, is dependent on many factors, right? It's dependent on these inputs we use. It's depending on the volume rendering technique we use. It's depending on the exact context in which you want to study the data. And so understanding where error manifests is actually quite tricky. We could do it at the image level, like what you're doing here. And that's kind of what I hinted at with, well, we could compare ground truth images to original images and learn the differences between them. That only tells you the output of the Viz process. It doesn't tell you all the different ways you could visualize the data. Anyone who's worked with volume data knows volume rendering is a way to visualize data, but it's not the only way to visualize data. So error might mean something different if you're not using volume renderer. And that means, well, there's an opportunity there to study, well, maybe, for example, with isosurfaces, how would the difference be? In fact, that's what this image is doing. It's not volume rendering, it's looking at a surface that's extracted at a particular value. These surfaces here, I think, manifest errors differently than volume rendered images do, which means we have an important thing that we need to convey, which is it just error in the volume, or is it error in the Viz process, or is it error in the surface? I mean, there's lots of different layers there that you could study this. So I don't know if I gave a really good answer to that question. I think I went off on a little bit of a tangent on my opinions on how we do evaluation.
That's good. That's good.
But I think it's important. I think neural networks can help. I don't think they'll ever solve the whole problem because of this fact that they're statistical in the end.
Okay, cool. So actually, I recently have a question from a student. So the question is like, it's a little bit technical question. So how does the residual connection function works during compression?
Let me see if I have a backup slide. I don't know if I do. I might have to refer to the paper to give you the answer to that. Essentially, what we're doing, though, is we're building connections. So let me show you this. And I can only give a high-level answer, unfortunately, because it is a little bit technical. We're basically building connections that pass information not just from one layer to the next, but layers to intermediate layers along the way. So what we're doing is we're basically studying, it ends up being weighted sums of things along the way that give information at various different levels. If you think about each of these, what they're doing is they're giving you a fit for basically applying a sinusoidal function for fitting and mapping the data along the way. And the residual connection, what it's doing is it's basically allowing you to pass information not just from one layer to the next, but across layers as well too. I realize that's not a great answer there, but the paper actually does, I think, a pretty good job of explaining this along the way. You can also check out the code. One thing that's really neat about this paper is if you go to the code for the paper itself, so that's the code that's linked here on this source here, you actually see the architecture for this network is kind of simple. Like it's nothing fancy. Like it's not like AlexNet or ImageNet or VGGG, all these like really complicated neural architectures for things like classification. This is literally just a stack of fully connected layers. So you can actually look at the code and kind of reverse engineer a little bit, and then some tricks on residual connections. I don't think I have a good slide, unfortunately, though, so I'm sorry I can't answer that question much better than that.
Okay, just refer to the paper.
Yeah, refer to the paper is a good way to start, for sure.
Okay, good. So for the time limitation, I think we will end the QA session here. So thanks again for Josh. Thanks for the great talk. So let's see. Dr. Xiaoru Yuan is here, right? No?
Yeah, it's okay. Just go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I just would like to introduce you guys. I think you guys definitely already know each other, but like Dr. Xiaoru Yuan is kind of the one who initiated this kind of lecture series.
Sure, I do know Xiaoru. It's great to see you again. I think the last time we've talked has probably been over email.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, thanks a lot, and to all the organizers, and especially to you, La, thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the chance to give the talk, and from all the questions, I think these were really great questions. So it sounds like folks hopefully enjoyed the talk as well too.
Yeah, I believe so. And thanks very much for the very interesting talk.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, cool. I think that's probably all for today's talk lecture. And finally, I would like to share my screen again and introduce our next talk. All right, so everybody, our next talk will be, two weeks later from today. It's December 16th, 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., the same time slot as it is today. And the speaker will be Klaus Muller from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, USA. And the title is Neural Word Embedding, Aiding the Human into the Loop. So looking forward to that. And all of you are welcome to join this talk 2 weeks later. All right, cool. That's all for today's lecture. And let's thanks Josh again. And thanks everybody for attending this talk. Great job, Josh.
Thanks again, everyone. It was my pleasure again. I really appreciated it.
All right, cool. All right, I think we can end this meeting now. All right, bye guys.